It's been a year since Donald Trump's shock election victory, and yet the controversies keep coming. This week, his former campaign chairman was charged with conspiring against the US, while another former campaign aide pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about his contacts with Russia. In this UpFront special, I'll challenge prominent conservative Trump supporter and former president of the US National Rifle Association, David Keene, on President Trump's record so far, and ask, when it comes to guns, whether the NRA is helping or hurting. David Keene, thanks for joining me on UpFront. Almost exactly a year ago, Donald Trump won the presidential election, proved all of his critics and opponents wrong. But what they don't seem to have been wrong about is that his presidency would be the disaster that it seems to have become. On Monday of this week, Paul Manafort, Trump's ex-campaign chair, was indicted on several charges, pleaded not guilty to several charges, including conspiracy against the United States. How bad do you think it is for a president of the US to have someone like Manafort indicted in that way? His former campaign chairman, a guy who he used to call him 20 times a day, called him a great asset, known him for 40 years. He lives inside Trump Tower, owns an apartment there. This guy is surrendering himself to the FBI.
Well, there are a lot of people that live in Trump Towers. I'll tell you this. When you look at what happened recently in these indictments, and there are a lot of legal experts that have looked at it and said basically what we're talking about is overcharging for purposes of leverage. Mr. Manafort, and I'm not here to defend him, and I'm not going to defend him, he was charged with his conspiracy against the United States was that he hadn't filed as a foreign agent for activities that took place long before he was associated with Trump in the campaign. The
indictments run until 2017. That's not true. Donald Trump lied this week on Twitter when he said that.
No, the
indictments run up to 2017 while he was employed
there are two
by
problems.
Donald Trump.
One,
let's be clear about that.
Very, very few people, if any, have been indicted on felony charges for what he did. It's generally a misdemeanor. Generally, what they say is you haven't registered, you need to do it. So there's that. Secondly, the money laundering charge that was brought against him on the face of it, is going to be very difficult to prove because the statute requires that for money laundering, you have to be laundering money that's the result of a crime.
When the campaign chairman of the President of the United States has to surrender himself, when the former campaign advisor to the President of the United States pleads guilty to lying to the FBI about his connections with Russia on behalf of Trump, you don't think that damages the President, makes the President look pretty suspicious?
Of course it looks bad. Two things, though. One, he was hired by Trump to do the convention, which is what he does. Secondly, none of these charges, as everybody's observed, have anything to do with collusion. None of them have to do with the campaign.
These are
financial charges against it.
The advisor who pleaded guilty is to do with collusion.
This other guy who I've never met was not even.
You've met him or not is irrelevant. He met with Trump.
I know that.
He worked with Trump.
Well, he was in campaigns put together these volunteer advisory boards. Yeah. They announced a whole bunch of people. Thank goodness a lot of those people never went into the administration or anything, but to say that's a high campaign advisor.
Well, he sat next to Trump. Trump called him an excellent guy.
I sat next to Trump,
Trump
and
called
I
him
don't
an excellent guy, but he did advise him. You've spoken in defense of Trump, saying in a speech last month that hoping for Trump's removal from office by impeachment or indictment for colluding with the nation's enemies is unconscionable and incredibly dangerous. Let's be clear. The Republican Party that you're a part of tried and failed to impeach Bill Clinton over a sex scandal with an intern. Some of them wanted to impeach Barack Obama over Benghazi, over executive orders, and the rest. And yet you're saying that Democrats and liberals shouldn't mention the word impeachment when Trump sacks his FBI chief, says, I did it because of Russia, and a former advisor pleads guilty to lying about his relationship with Russia.
I never said that they shouldn't mention it. I think that impeachment is something that divides and is very difficult to do. The impeachment against Clinton didn't work.
But you would accept it's a legitimate discussion right now, given the kind of severity of things we're talking about.
Impeachment is a political tool. Congress has every right to do that. Whether it's wise or whether it can succeed or whether it's good for the country.
No, you called it unconscionable.
It is unconscionable.
It's unconscionable to say that the president might be working with the nation's enemies, therefore we should investigate and maybe impeach him.
They are investigating. There is no evidence. There is no evidence that the president has ever worked with the nation's enemies.
There is evidence that people around Trump are tied to Russia. Trump may be tied to Russia. We've not seen his tax records.
What does that mean?
What does what mean?
Tied to Russia.
Connections with Russia. We know that Donald Trump
knows
Jr.
Russians?
No,
I know Russians.
No, it means they met with Russian government officials to try and obtain dirt.
You've met with government Russian officials.
Not to obtain dirt in a U.S. election campaign. You know that's against the law.
There's no evidence.
Yes, there is. There's evidence that Donald Trump Jr. has met with them. Well, we know
they met with them.
Okay, here's what I don't get. The NSA, the FBI, the CIA all say Vladimir Putin interfered in the election. What do you know that they don't know?
I don't know anything that they don't know.
But you're claiming it's all made up. You think it's all imagined.
I'll tell you this.
You think it's all imagined?
The Russians, the Americans, we've all, quote, interfered in elections all the time. Yeah. Doesn't usually work. Yeah.
So are you pro-Russian involvement?
No, that's not my point.
I'm not denying that everyone interferes.
That is not my point.
You don't seem bothered by it. I can't imagine if President Hillary Clinton had her campaign chairman indicted, her advisor pleading guilty to Russian conduct. She had sacked the FBI chief. You'd be sitting here saying it's dangerous and unconscionable.
Business partners.
You'd say dangerous and unconscionable if President Hillary Clinton, she'd be impeached by now by the GOP if she had done 10% of what Trump does. You know that and I know that.
No, that's not true.
Just to be clear, I mean, one of the issues, and we're going to talk about guns in your new book, obviously Donald Trump had the support of the NRA, even though he used to be a big supporter of gun control. But he switched on that like he switched on a lot of things. How can you trust him on gun control or any other issue? This is a guy who, according to the Washington Post, has made 1,300 false statements since his inauguration. That's around 5 lies a day. And you trust him?
You know, I don't know that that's true either, but we do trust him on that for a variety of reasons. One, he made a commitment. Secondly, he stuck to the commitment. And we're very pleased with what he's substantively done in this area, and particularly, and this isn't just people that are Second Amendment supporters, but the Constitution and the Supreme Court became a big issue in 2016. He made a commitment that he would appoint people who were basically originalists like Antonin Scalia, the late justice, to the court. With the appointment of Neil Gorsuch, he delivered on that. The appointments of this administration at the lower levels in the courts have been something that conservatives had liked. So substantively, can we trust him? Yes, I think we can.
You must be one of the few people who say that. David Keene, on the subject of guns, it's been over a month since a gunman killed 58 people and injured more than 400 people in Las Vegas in what is considered to be one of the deadliest mass shootings in modern American history. And yet, apart from offering condolences and prayers, neither the president nor Congress has done anything in terms of legislation to stop such an attack from happening again. Do you know of any other government in the world that would sit back and do nothing, as the US government does with the NRA's support, after each and every mass shooting?
The question is, what can you do? What law could you pass that would have prevented what happened there, or prevented some of these things? Now, let's put these mass shootings and the killing of any person, whether it's with a gun or a knife or with a truck, is a tragedy. But let's ask ourselves, what can you do that's been proposed that would prevent that sort of thing? And one of the reasons that a lot of these new laws that are feel-good laws that have been suggested by people haven't been passed is because they ultimately come up to the question of this, and this is what happens in Congress and elsewhere. If that law passed, would it have prevented this, or would it prevent another activity like this? And the answer is always, well, no, but it would be a good thing to do.
Many would say that the laws haven't passed because of the power of the NRA lobbying to prevent those laws, which have public support.
Obviously, we speak for millions and millions of American gun owners.
You do.
But the fact of the matter is that speaking for people is not enough. You also have to be able to make a case.
Okay, so making a case, you say, what can be done? This is a global channel, a global TV show. Millions of people around the world are watching this who don't have the same problems with guns that the United States has. Other countries have managed to solve this problem. Do you know what the UK government did in March 1996 after a man shot and killed 16 children in Dunblane, Scotland?
In Great Britain, today.
What did the UK do?
They banned, I mean, you even have to go outside of Britain to practice for the Olympics.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And there's been how many mass shootings with a handgun since 1996?
Usually mass shootings don't take place with handguns.
Well, this one did. Dunblane did.
Okay.
So how many since then?
I don't keep track.
Zero. Surprise, surprise.
Well, there aren't very many mass shootings anywhere.
Do you know, apart from in the United States?
No, that's not true.
Do you know what the Australian government did in April 1996 when a man used an automatic rifle to kill 35 people?
Yeah, they banned them, and they banned shotguns, and they destroyed most of the weapons.
Do you know how many mass shootings there have been in Australia since 1996?
If you talk about mass shootings as opposed to violent crime in Australia,
that's not what we're talking about. I asked about shootings.
People are not able to defend themselves and their families.
Okay, but you do realise that the gun violence went down in Australia and in the UK.
It's true that if you don't have a gun, you'll have to use a knife or a baseball bat or something else.
And you won't have the same number of deaths. And you won't have the same number of deaths. There aren't the same number of deaths.
There are the same number of deaths.
Do you believe there are the same number of deaths with baseball bats as there are with guns? Is that your contention, David
just as an example, for this country, according to the U.S. government, every year more people are beaten to death with fists than are killed with all the long guns, including semi-automatic weapons, period.
Okay.
So should we ban fists?
We can't ban fists, obviously, but you can ban weaponry. You can restrict it. And no one's even asking for banning it. There's a Second Amendment in the Constitution in this country. Your book is about that, which says the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. But it's about restricting access. The US has nearly 6 times the gun homicide rate as Canada, 7 times as high as Sweden, 16 times as high as Germany. And you're saying we can't do anything about it. Everyone else in the Western world has managed to do something about it.
Those are very different countries.
Exactly, because they don't have a Second Amendment and they don't have this gun culture that you have.
We have a gun culture which we're very proud of.
Even though it leads to way higher deaths.
And the title of the book that you referenced that I co-authored, Shall Not Be Infringed, is a reference to not just the Second Amendment, but the reason the Second Amendment was adopted. It did not establish in this country the right to own a firearm, nor did it establish the right to defend oneself. What it did was recognize the pre-existing right that philosophers have talked about for thousands of years, of the right of a man and a woman to defend themselves, their families, their communities against hostile actors. And the United States, at the time of its formation, incorporated that right into the Constitution so it would be there.
A lot of people, again, watching around the world would say, so what? 1791, I think the Second Amendment was passed. Things change. The world moves on. Slaves were mentioned in the Constitution in 1791. The United States abolished slavery, amended the Constitution. Why are you tying?
I think a lot of your viewers...
It's not Holy Scripture, is it? Why do you tie yourselves to something when thousands of people are dying as a result of that?
In a lot of countries know that they would like to have the right to defend themselves and their families. The United States is not the most violent country.
Do you know how many countries in the world guarantee a right to bear arms in their constitution apart from the United States?
That's not the point.
No, but do you know how many?
In most,
do you know how many follow America's path?
Let's go back to Britain for a second.
It's a very simple question.
In Britain, if you defend yourself, you can be arrested.
Nobody in Britain looks at America and says, we want America's gun problems. I can assure you, having spent my life in the United Kingdom, I think you'll show the polling is just like American polling. The majority of Americans want gun control. You do realize the NRA is in a minority.
No.
It is. The polls show that even gun owners, a majority of gun owners support universal background checks, support a gun database.
It depends entirely on how you ask the question. And in fact, the support for Second Amendment rights is growing. In today's, if you look at polls, the cohort that is most supportive today of Second Amendment rights are the youngest voters that are coming in. So and attitudes change over time, but support for the Second Amendment, support for the right of self-defense.
I didn't ask about the Second Amendment. Nice goalpost shifting. The majority of gun owners and the majority of Americans support universal background checks, a gun database, more gun control, which your organization doesn't. In fact, the majority of Americans aren't gun owners.
Pardon me?
The majority of Americans aren't even gun owners.
Well, it depends. About half
You
are.
represent a minority.
About half are.
No, 30% according to the Pew polling from this year.
It depends again on the poll. It depends on what you ask. But let me tell you this. When you say something like, do you believe in universal background checks? That's a feel-good question. Then when you ask questions about, do you think that if you sell a gun or give a gun to your grandchild, that should require you to go to the government and get a thing? Then they say, oh, no. The biggest gun seller in America is Walmart. If you go to Walmart, and that's where most or places like that.
But the point is, you can buy guns outside of Walmart.
You can buy guns
without an ID, without providing any ID.
Oh, well, you can buy in a private sale, just as you can buy a car in a private sale without going through a dealer.
Yeah, but you still have to get paperwork for a car. You have to do it. You have to get a license to drive a car.
Very few firearms are ever purchased that way. In fact, there have been studies of felons. Where do you get your guns? They don't get them legally.
It's interesting. It's interesting. Well, I'll come back to that point. It's interesting you mentioned cars. It can be a deadly weapon, as we saw in New York, a truck or a car. But you need a license to drive a car. You need a health check to drive a car. You need a sight test to drive a car. You need to pass a test to drive a car. You need to get insurance.
There's nothing in the Constitution that guarantees you the right to drive a car. That's seen as a privilege.
Agreed. You brought up the car, but you know what is in the Constitution? A right to vote. Why is it easier to buy a gun in the majority of American states than it is easier to vote?
It is not.
Yes, it is.
It is not.
You don't need to photo ID to buy a gun. You just told me. You just told me a moment ago.
No, you do not. Let me tell you what the law is, as opposed to just bantering back and forth.
You just told me.
No,
you just told our viewers that you could get a gun in a private sale without ID.
No,
you cannot vote in 32 states without ID.
If you're a private seller Most private sales where there's any question, for example, if you go to a gun show, 99% of the firearms that are sold by dealers, because that's who's there, people with licenses. That requires a background check. The law says that if you sell me a gun and you have any reason to suspect that I might be a prohibited person, somebody that wouldn't pass a background check, then you become liable. Now, what happens at a gun show in Virginia, for example, is the state police have a table there, and for $5, you can have a background check run on me.
Okay, but that's with respect, that's all voluntary.
Wait a minute. So
can I? No, we need to be clear because we're running out of time. Can I buy a gun in the U.S. from my next door neighbor or from my brother
from your next door
without
neighbor?
providing any ID? Yes or no?
If he doesn't know you, he'd be dangerous selling you a gun.
That's not what I
ID.
asked. Deal with the question I asked. Can I buy a gun from my neighbor or my best friend or my brother without providing ID? Can I vote in 32 states in America without providing ID? No.
Yes.
Therefore, it is easier.
Yes, you can.
No, you cannot. You cannot.
In most states, you can.
No, in 32 states, you need to provide ID when you go to vote.
Do you vote with your brother?
In 32 states.
If you have a family election?
My point is, it is easier to buy a gun than to vote.
No, it is not.
That is what kind of democracy? It is. You've just admitted it.
Not.
That you don't need ID. You just admitted it.
In a family.
To my friends, to my neighbors.
So if you have a family council, you don't have to have ID.
Okay, I think you made the point that you don't need ID to buy a gun. That is astonishing.
Truly ridiculous analogy.
No, I think it's a very valid point that it's easier to buy a gun without ID than it is to vote without ID. I think that's a pretty astonishing fact. Let's go back to the legal illegal point. You made the point about where do criminals get their guns. You look at some of the iconic mass shootings, the horrible mass shootings we've seen, some of the deadly mass shootings we've seen in America and in the United States in recent years. You think of Las Vegas most recently. You think of Orlando. You think of Sandy Hook. You think of Aurora. You think of San Bernardino. You think of the church in South Carolina. The shooters obtain their guns legally. Right. That doesn't bother you.
Virtually all of the difference being Sandy Hook, where the shooter was a deranged young man who shot his mother, killed his mother, and stole the gun from her. In the other instances, take Las Vegas as the most recent example. This guy had never been arrested for anything. He would have passed any background check and did to purchase his gun. So it's very difficult to imagine
the system's a mess.
Pardon?
So the system you support, the status quo you support, is a mess. You're admitting that these mass shootings happen with legally owned guns.
Of course.
There's nothing you can do about it. Throw your hands up in the air.
No, I didn't say that, because in each of these cases, and there are specific
San
cases.
Loads and loads of ammo.
Let's finish this. The Aurora shooter as one. The shooter that went to the Navy Yard here, and in most of these other cases, somebody recognized there was something wrong with these people. The Aurora shooter was thrown out of a gun range. In Rhode Island, the fellow who shot up the Navy Yard was stopped by the police, who called the Navy and said there's something wrong with this guy. And in each of these cases, these are not traditional criminals. These are people who have mental health problems.
Not all of them, but yes, some of them. 3 out of 4 guns used in mass shootings between 1982 and 2012 were obtained legally.
Yeah.
So it's not, you can't just say the criminals getting guns illegally.
So the question is,
you need to control the sale of guns. If this is what's
the control of guns is.
Why does the Las Vegas shooter need 42 guns?
These were not bought on the black market. These are people.
Exactly.
These are people who had background checks.
The system doesn't work.
They had background checks. They purchased the firearms legally, and there was something wrong with them that could not be picked up in either a background check or their criminal records or in any other way. So what would you do?
Okay. Study after study shows, again and again, whether it's by the National Bureau of Economic Research, Boston University School of Public Health, University of Harvard, University of Toronto, that states in the US that have tighter gun control laws and fewer guns have fewer gun-related homicides, suicides, and accidental deaths. That's just a fact across the board.
Over 60% of the homicides with firearms take place in a number of major urban centers. Most of them are related to drugs, guns, and mental difficulties. And let's take the sort of poster child for gun violence today, which is Chicago. In Chicago, you have the tightest gun control laws of any major city with the exception of New York. And in Chicago, if you were to take a gun and rob a 7-Eleven, you would have committed at least 2 crimes: the state crime of robbing the 7-Eleven and a federal crime of using a firearm to commit a felony. In all of the federal jurisdictions in this country where there are the least indictments for doing that, for committing the federal crime of using a firearm to commit a felony, Chicago. because they try not to blame the criminal, they try to blame the gun.
And yet, despite Chicago, the most gun deaths happen in states with looser gun laws and more guns. That's what all the studies show. The Internal Medicine Journal study of 2013, a higher number of firearm laws in a state are associated with a lower rate of firearms fatalities, lower rates of suicides and homicides.
How come we have so many, how come most of the homicides take place in major cities, 60% of them, in major cities that have the tightest gun control laws? Explain that to me.
Well, I'm asking you, National Bureau of Economic Research. I'm quoting studies. You're asking kind of rhetorical questions. U.S. states with more guns have more gun homicides. National Bureau of Economic Research. The more guns there are, the more deaths there are.
Which states are those? Which states are those?
It's both common sense and it's supported by every study. Do you have any studies that show the otherwise?
No.
When I say to you the US has 6 times the gun homicide rate of Canada, 7 times Sweden, 16 times as Germany, you're okay with that? Let's just be clear. You're okay with that? Because
I'm not okay with one person being killed by anything.
No. I'm asking about the rates. You're okay that because I said to you, you're unique. You said we're proud of that. You're proud that you have 16 times as many gun homicides as Germany.
Wait a minute. Is that because of the existence of guns?
Yes. What do you think it's because of? That every other Western country doesn't have the
Let me just ask you a question based on all your studies and on the government studies. 20 years ago and today, there were probably half as many guns in circulation 20 years ago as there are today. How does the murder rate compare?
That's because crime has gone down across the board.
It's half of what it was then.
Yes, because a crack epidemic is over, more police on the street. There are many factors for that. Come on, that's not how you do studies.
I didn't say there aren't other factors, did I?
Well, that's what you're suggesting.
No, I did not. I am saying that your argument that homicides are a result of the existence of guns is clearly not true. There's not a direct relationship.
There's not a direct relationship between, okay. So the US is just a freak of nature that the United States has so many more gun deaths than the other Western countries that don't have the same level of guns, do have stronger gun laws, have in the UK and Australia banned guns.
The United States is very different.
Okay, it's a coincidence.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me ask you this. Do you think it's wise when you have parents grieving the deaths of children in places like Sandy Hook, when you have 90 people a day being killed, you have suicides with guns, do you believe it's wise in a country where guns cause so much anguish and harm to families for you to say that guns are cool, as you did a few years ago?
Sure. Those are not related kinds of things. You know, more people say people are killed by automobiles. I think a lot of cars are cool.
Okay, but
that's your question.
You see the difference between a weapon? An automobile is not designed to be a weapon. A gun is. You don't see the difference, really?
The problem is the person that's using it, not the gun. I've never seen a gun jump off a shelf and kill anybody. So I've seen criminals use guns. I've seen people who have mental problems use guns.
And non-criminals use guns, as we discussed. So just to be clear, we've run out of time, but I do want to say, so the problem is the person using the gun, so then shouldn't the NRA support lots of gun control to stop people from getting so many guns?
We support
43 guns the Las Vegas shooting
prosecuting criminals who misuse firearms.
And we always have. So you don't care about prevention?
No, let's talk about homicide rights. You know, this is back in the 90s when we funded this, but in the 90s, the number 4 city in this country in terms of the homicide rate was Richmond, Virginia, and we funded something which was called Project Exile. And what it was to get everybody that used a firearm illegally prosecuted under the federal law. We advertised it was 5 years in prison. Within the first year, the homicide rate dropped 30%. The next year, it dropped 20%. Because if you prosecute gun criminals, you lessen gun crime. The fact is that one of the empirical pieces of evidence you can look at is that if you prosecute gun crime goes down because criminals, now we're not talking about the insane person, the mentally ill, somebody who commits suicide, but
the vast majority of gun deaths, gun shootings not carried out by mentally ill people,
you're talking about crime. Gun crime goes down because criminals, we might not think they're rational, but they are.
Actually, I'm talking about gun deaths across the board.
If they know that they're going to be arrested and prosecuted and imprisoned for committing a crime with a firearm, they're not likely to do it.
And that wouldn't reduce the vast majority of deaths, which are from suicides, from accidental deaths. It wouldn't solve that problem. You'd still have record level of deaths. Let me ask you this last question. You have kids in schools here doing security drills to prepare for mass shootings. You have metal detectors everywhere. You have mass shootings becoming more and more commonplace. You do realize, don't you, David Keene, that the rest of the world looks at the United States, looks at your gun culture, and thinks you're all a bit mad to tolerate this, to live like this.
Following Sandy Hook, the NRA asked that every school district in every jurisdiction ought to look at the schools and ask, how do we protect our kids? At first, the administration and the president himself said that's an insane idea because they want armed guards. And then they realized that there are armed guards, what they call school security officers, you know, in most of the big city schools. And in this country today, schools have locks, they have lights to prevent rapes, to prevent all of this. Some of them have firearms, some of them protect themselves. Protecting your kids is a good idea. A lot of schools have security officers and have had and will have and should have, but that's up to each school. This is a country where that's up to each school district, to the parents, the administrators, and the law enforcement officers.
David Keene, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
My pleasure.